Hello everyone. This chapter is going to cover the skeletal and muscular system, how the skeleton works, how bones are formed, how they're put together, where they come from. The same with muscles, how they're put together, how they work, and how those two things interact. So let's go ahead and get started with it. So muscles interact with the skeleton. I think you guys probably know this by now. The bones provide attachment points and really hard things for the muscles to attach to, and the muscles move the bones around. So without the muscles, the bones would not be able to move, and without the bones, the muscles would not be able to move anything. So essentially, the muscles are the pulley cord, and the bones are the winch. The muscles are the winch and the winch cord, and the bones are the truck. Without the winch, the truck wouldn't be able to pull anything, and without the truck, the winch wouldn't be able to pull anything either. So they both interact with one another to make things work. And that's how you lift things up. So the muscles pull, which moves the bones, and then the bones pull against the muscles, and they work one another to lift things up and make you walk and things like that. So everything on the planet that's considered a vertebrate is going to have some sort of skeleton or chordate of some sort. But there's 3 different types of skeletons, and they're not that difficult to understand. They're pretty easy. You have a hydrostatic skeleton here, commonly found in jellyfish and little critters like that, worms and things. An exoskeleton, and then you have an endoskeleton. So a hydrostatic skeleton works a lot like a water balloon. The water is on the inside, and the little membrane, the latex balloon, is the body part, the tissue of the little jellyfish here. And then all the water that's on the inside keeps the jellyfish inflated. Without the water on the inside, he'd just deflate. He would just die. So the water acts as his quote-unquote bones, if you like, to keep his flesh open. Our exoskeleton here, our little crab, has the hard chitin exoskeleton that covers his body, which keeps the stuff out and keeps things in. He just has his bones on the outside. And then our endoskeleton here, like us, our fish and things like that, alligators, birds, critters like that, have bones on the inside. So we have soft on the outside, hard on the inside. These guys have hard on the inside, soft on the outside, and then these guys are just soft on top of soft. So that's how this works. So pretty easy to understand the different types of skeletons. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of tissue that are going to be found inside of a skeleton system. Now, this is going to be more for a traditional skeleton like us. Going to be the endoskeleton with the bones on the inside. So this is going to be what this is going to be over. So there's lots of different types of tissue inside of a skeleton. You have connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. So let's go ahead and talk about those real fast. We'll get to those in a second. Let's start with bones. So bones obviously make up the skeleton. You can break the skeleton up into 2 different parts. You have the axial skeleton, or the axis of the body. That's going to be your spinal cord and your skull. Your spinal column, your vertebral column, and your skull. And then you have the appendicular skeleton, which is the other part, the blue part here, and your appendages. So keep that in mind when you think about that. The appendages, the appendicular skeleton, and then the axis, that they all rotate around. So you rotate your shoulders and your pelvis around the axis of your body, the axial skeleton. Pretty easy to figure out what these parts do. The axial skeleton protects the soft parts of your body, all the important parts that keep you running. Your brain, you got to keep that stuff going. Your eyeballs, your nose, and things like that. You want the sensory organs to function. The ribs provide a nice protection layer for the soft organs, the soft heart and things inside, your lungs and things that you need to keep working. And then your spinal cord is going to be protected by the vertebra. So all the important parts that you really need, you can live without your arms, you can live without your legs, but all this stuff in here, you got to keep protected. You got to keep safe to keep the body functioning and working like to keep you alive, kind of thing. So that's what the axial skeleton's part is to do. It also allows you to move. Your body rotates around the axis of itself. So it keeps you alive, protects all the important parts, and allows your body to rotate around it. So the appendicular skeleton is going to consist of the limbs, like I mentioned already, the arms and the legs. You got the pelvic girdle that rotates around the hind limbs, and the pectoral girdle, which rotates around the forelimbs. So pretty easy to figure out what those 2 things do. The vertebral column, as I mentioned, supports the spinal cord. The ribs protect the heart and the lungs and all the stuff inside of there. If your vertebral column is crooked, sometimes this can happen during development, some sort of issue. The spine comes out curved in the baby. This is a disorder called scoliosis. You can correct this with braces and things like that. Or you can correct it in utero now before the baby's born. But a long time ago, they couldn't. People had crooked spines like this. King Richard III of England was known to have scoliosis. And they talked about that in the literature if you've ever read Shakespeare. He had scoliosis. So bones have several different functions. Obviously, as I've talked about, they allow you to move around. But they also are going to supply calcium and phosphorus to the rest of the body. So calcium is going to be removed from the bones to feed the rest of the body with calcium. It's also going to have to be replaced at some point in time, which we'll talk about in a second. And if it's removed faster than it's replaced, you end up with osteoporosis, and then your bones start to fall apart. And inside of your bone marrow, or your blood, your bones, you're going to have a big giant hollow cavity called the marrow cavity. You can see that here. And inside of that, in adult bones anyway, you're going to have yellow bone marrow. It's kind of a fatty tissue. People eat this a lot for delicacies and other than that. And in growing bones, you're going to have red bone marrow, which is going to grow red blood cells in the developing cells, which will eventually become the white blood cells and the rest of the immune cells and things inside of it. So there's two different types of bone. You have spongy bone up here, and then you have hard bone around it. Compact bone is the technical name for that. So spongy bone and then compact bone. But they're very, very interesting little things. They are living organs. You don't really think of a bone as living, but if you've ever broken one, you know the pain of it. So if it was just a dead thing inside of you, you wouldn't feel it. It wouldn't hurt at all if you drilled into a bone or you broke it, but unfortunately it does. So it's obviously a living part of you. But bones are going to consist of a very hard mineral layer of calcium and things like that, extra stuff, the hard part. And inside of that, you're going to have collagen fibers embedded inside of it, which are going to allow it to bend a little bit. But it also is going to keep a lot of strength and rigidity in bone. If you've ever had fresh bone, you know they bend just a little bit before they break. And that's that collagen that's embedded inside of it that's going to allow it to get a little bit of flexibility before it breaks, because if it broke instantly, that wouldn't be good. Break a glass. So as I mentioned, you have that big cavity in the middle, the marrow cavity. In the middle, you have red bone marrow that's going to eventually, as you age, as you get older, as you become an adult, your limbs quit growing. Eventually, that red bone marrow, which is going to be producing blood cells, platelets, and things like that for your body, is eventually going to be replaced by yellow bone marrow, which is a little more fatty substance, just keeps the bone kind of occupied. But eventually, that yellow bone marrow can revert back to red bone marrow if it needs to, if you get damaged. If you lose a limb or something in your body needs to replace something extra, needs more of something, you can your yellow bone marrow can revert back to red bone marrow and start making more blood cells and things like that if it needs to. Now, inside of a bone, it does grow, it does develop, and there's lots of blood vessels and nerves and things that run all throughout the bone. And if you've ever looked at a bone underneath a microscope, you know it looks kind of like tree rings with a hollow center. The little hollow center is where all the little nerves and blood vessels and things are going to be running all throughout it. This is going to allow the body to exchange blood vessels, or to exchange blood with the surface of the skin, with the rest of the muscles, the rest of the tissue in the body as well. You also have to protect nerves and things that are on the inside of those bones, like the spinal cord. You have to keep it nourished as well. So you have to feed it and you have to keep those cells alive. So obviously you have to have holes and things to be able to get through the bone. And this is how they do this. They have canals that run through these little holes that run all the way through the bone, with the marrow cavity in the middle. And all the nerves and stuff, the big ones run through the middle, with all the little tiny ones that come off of them run through the columns, the canals in the bone off to the side. So as I mentioned, you have compact bone and spongy bone. The compact bone works a lot like the Ripple's cardboard. If you've ever know what I'm talking about on the side of boxes, It adds a lot of strength, but it doesn't add a lot of weight. If this was full of hard, dense bone, it would be really heavy. Your skeleton would weigh a lot. You might not be able to run as fast, and it would take a lot of energy to make that. It just doesn't need to be that strong. This adds the sufficient amount of strength by having holes in it. Still keeps it light, but still keeps it strong. So this is why this is formed at the heavy parts of the bone, the ends and things like that. But on the sides of the bone, where it's quite thin, you're going to have a compact bone, which is very dense, very rigid, which is going to be giving it strength where it needs it, and make sure that it's not going to break where it needs to, but doesn't have to be super dense. Whereas over here, you don't have to have the thickness, so it's still not going to break. It's got a lot stronger, but it's not going to break as much. Down here, you got a lot more space, but over here, you need a very thick one because the wall is a lot more shallow, a lot thinner kind of thing. So that's the two different types of bone, spongy bone and compact bone. Surrounding the ends of all the bones, for the most part, lots of the important ones, especially ones that rub on top of one another, are cartilage. You can see those all here. Now, all that cartilage, what it does is it rotates around it, where bones rub up against one another. It creates friction, and that's bone on bone is going to be very painful. If you have anybody with arthritis, they know what that pain is. That's exactly what this is caused by. When that cartilage degrades, the bones start rubbing up on top of one another. When you have the cartilage there, what it's meant to do is essentially it works like a little pillow between the two bones. So you can rub your knees on the floor, and that hurts very painfully. But if you rub your knees on a pillow on top of the floor, you don't feel the floor. And that's what the cartilage is for. It essentially keeps the bones from rubbing on one another. And that keeps the pain from occurring. It also keeps the bones from rubbing each other, wearing down, and things like that. So cartilage wearing down over time is essentially going to be very painful, and that's what causes arthritis and things like that in people. So as you are growing, your bones are going to grow as well, which is how you get taller. Also, why we're not born 6 foot tall. Also, why you can start out tiny like this and not be having to be born a full-size adult human. If you had full-size adult bones, that would be a very unpleasant birth. But anyway, bones start out as cartilage, very soft, porous, flexible material, but still very strong. So as you start to develop, your cartilage is going to be essentially replaced by bone over time as you age. Now, this is for multiple reasons. Children are quite clumsy. They break, they fall, they squish. Their parents drop them from time to time. They get in accidents. Kids are clumsy. And if they had hard, rigid bones, they would probably break all the time. Also, you have to be able to fit through the birth canal. And if you had hard, rigid bones that wouldn't flex around, that would probably be a very unpleasant birth for your mother, and she might die. It would rip her apart. But fortunately, the cartilage allows you to be soft and squishy and flexible. So when you bang into the TV or you bounce off the couch or you're trying to push through the birth canal, you can squish and soft and squish around and not break. And that's kind of how that works. But the older you get, the more, hopefully, the better, less clumsy you get, the more need you have for strong bones. You eventually will reach the size that you won't grow anymore, so those bones become fully calcified. They become full length. They turn into full calcium. There's no cartilage growing and being replaced by bone over time. So the older you get, the less calcium the less cartilage, that's in your bones, until you just get the ones on the end that work like the little shock absorbers for keeping you from rubbing bone on bone kind of thing. So joints are where bones meet bone, and you can see the cartilage in here that keeps your bones from rubbing up against one another. And around here you have fluid that keeps the friction down. It works kind of like lubrication, like oil, to keep the bones from rubbing up against one another, to keep the cartilage from wearing down, to give it a little squishiness. So if something hits it or if it moves around, if you've ever put your hand underneath, you can kind of feel the movement around inside of it kind of thing. And that fluid just protects the connective tissues around it from drying out. Keeps it a little extra cushion as well, kind of a little airbag effect. So attached to your bones And to your muscles that allow you to move around are going to be ligaments and tendons. So tendons are very strong connective tissues that are going to be used to move bones and muscles around. And the tendons are going to be holding the muscles to your bone, and that's how the muscle is going to be attached to bone. Muscles it doesn't just sit on top of the bone; it's actually held to the bone with tendons. If you've ever cleaned an animal, you have to cut the tendons loose from the bone. Now, ligaments are going to be holding bone to bone. So if you've ever grabbed the back of your knee, the ligament that sits right there is going to allow you to move your heel. It's going to run all the way up to the back of your pelvis and things, or to the back of your femur. So it's going to allow you to move your leg up in one of those motions like that. It's going to move the bone instead of holding a muscle to the bone. So ligaments move bones, tendons hold muscles to bones. Now, I mentioned earlier the calcium coming into your bones and calcium going out. Now, as calcium comes into your bones, it's going to be used to strengthen the bones, and then eventually it's going to be moved out of your bones as well. But it has to be replaced, or else the bones will eventually degrade. And this is what happens when calcium is not replaced. Osteoporosis. It happens from lack of calcium in the bones. They start to weaken. They start to get soft. They start to break. This is natural. A strong bone that doesn't have osteoporosis. You can see the difference between them. You can see the wear and the breaking down of here. So without that, you have to have calcium, or without the necessary calcium in your bones or in your system, you're going to have bones start to degrade. And that's going to be causing some severe pain. It can cause people to get slumps, bone breakings under normal circumstances. Just walking, and your leg can break and things like that. So very weak and brittle bones kind of thing. To move your muscles, it takes energy. This one makes perfect sense. You have to have energy to power the body. This is powering of the body that's moving, so you have to have energy to do this. Lots and lots and lots of things throughout the body. There's going to be, lots of things interact with muscles, lots of different types of muscles under the muscle system. You have more than 600 different types of skeletal muscles alone. Now, there's two main different types of muscles. You have voluntary muscles and involuntary muscles. Now, voluntary muscle is one that you can control. Things like your fingers, your eyes, your arms, your legs, things that you can think about and make it move. And then you have involuntary muscles, which are things like reflexes, like your pupils dilating. You can't control your pupils dilating if someone shines a light in your eye. You can't control your heart beating. You can't control the movement of your food through your intestines, peristalsis. You can't control that. So those are called involuntary muscles, things that you don't have control over. So muscles that you traditionally have control over are usually called skeletal muscles. You also have cardiac muscles and smooth muscles, and that's what these are. So skeletal muscles are muscles that are attached directly to your bones that allow you to move. They are voluntary. You can control them around. You can move them and things like that. They're going to be used to insulate you for body warmth and allow you to stand upright for structure. They're going to be to protect the bones underneath, and they're also going to allow you to move. And that's the point of those types of skeletal muscles are. So pretty easy on that one. So there are other types of tissue than muscle tissue. You have nervous tissue and connective tissue. So muscles work in pair. I'll start with the muscle tissue. You have the abductor and the abductor, one that pulls the muscle up, and then you have the one that lets the muscle down. So for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So you have the muscle that pulls the arm up, and then the muscle that pulls the arm down. If you pick your leg up, you have the muscle that pulls the leg up, and then you have the muscle that lets the leg back down. Traditionally, the muscle that pulls up is usually a little bit bigger than bigger than the muscle that pulls down. So the bicep's usually larger than the triceps. The muscle that does the pulling up work is usually bigger than the muscle that lets down. So this is the anatomy of a muscle cell. You can see here muscles are just essentially tiny little repeating units. If you've ever seen a copper wire with all the little tiny copper wire filaments inside of it all sheathed together, this is essentially what goes on here. You have one big muscle cell that has a tiny bunch of little tiny cells, muscle bundles inside of it called a muscle sheath, muscle fiber. Inside of that, you have independent little muscle cells. And inside of that, you have long things, long filaments of called sarcomeres, or little repeating units of long filaments of myosin and actin. Now I'm going to rely a little bit on the supplemental video here to show you guys how muscle activity works. So you can actually watch the myosin and actin move around, but I'll kind of walk through it very briefly. So how this works really quickly. You have giant thick filament here of myosin and a tiny little thin filament of actin. These two guys interact with one another to allow muscles to move. You can see here the purple is the actin, the big thick ones is the myosin, the big thick orange ones. So actin, tiny, myosin, big thick. So essentially how this works. You can see here this is a skeletal muscle, striated muscle underneath the microscope. These little striations are the different bands, these things called sarcomeres, the different independent little units of these actin and myosin filaments here. So what's going to happen is the actin's going to move down. You can see it's going to bend these little things that poke up on the myosin filaments. This actin's going to bend down here, grab a hold of this, and pull it forward. Going to grab a hold here and pull forward. And it's going to inch its way, kind of inchworm walk, just like your fingers. You can kind of see here. And it's going to inchworm walk its way up. So you can see that it's going to relax, your muscles relax, and then you tense them up. It's going to pull forward a little bit, relax, tense them up, relax, tense them up, relax, tense it up. And that's how they work. So every time that they tense up, they get a little closer and closer and closer to one another. And eventually they'll reach the end where the muscles fully contract, and then it's ready for you to punch or pick something up and things like that. So the muscle is ready to go, fully tensed, and you're ready to put as much action, as much force as you possibly can into that muscle. And then as you relax, the muscle is going to release. The muscle actin and myosin filaments are going to release, and they're just going to fall apart. And this is essentially how this works. The more actin and myosin filament you have, the more sarcomeres that you have, the more strength that you have in that muscle. You can build them up by exercise, things like that, working out, building up more muscle mass, which we'll talk about in a second. So this is where I'm going to toss it over to the supplemental videos. They're on YouTube. You can find the websites, the links on the e-learn shell of how this works. Okay, sorry, I went too far. So nerves are power muscles. Each nerve comes from your brain, from the spinal cord, and is going to innervate a specific muscle cell. Now, the brain is going to tell the muscle cell what to do, or then that signal is going to be sent via the nerves down to that muscle cell. Each independent muscle cell has its own nerve that is attached to it that tells it directly what to do. Now I'm going to toss this over to the supplemental videos again to show you how this works. It's easier to see things float across on video than it is when we talk about it. So there's lots of different types of muscles, and we've talked about this a little bit. You have different units of muscles. Motor units are going to be essentially just groups of muscles. So little tiny muscles, small groups that don't do a lot of work, big muscle groups that do a lot of work, and things like that. I talked about this already. The more units that are in that muscle, the more strength you can do. So naturally, some muscles are stronger than others. Biceps are stronger than triceps just because they're bigger. But once again, you can add more motor units by working out and things like that. So there's two different types of muscle fibers. You have slow twitch and fast twitch. Slow twitch fibers, these are going to be used for long distance endurance. So things like running, people that play soccer, football, people are soccer and long distance running, people that use long distance things. They use energy very slowly. They're very tough, they're very strong, and they last a very long time. They don't wear out quickly. Whereas fast twitch fibers, the other type of muscle fiber, are going to use a lot of energy, and they tire out very quickly. And this is going to be things that are going to be people that lift up weights very quickly, very short-term runners and things like that. Just very fast burn, runs out very fast, very quickly kind of thing. And you can kind of understand how this one works if you think about what these muscles do. This guy probably couldn't run a marathon, and this person here probably could not pick up that weight Their muscles are just simply built for different things. It's what they do with the different. They've specialized and trained for different purposes. And then this woman over here is built more slow twitch fibers for endurance, whereas this guy over here has built more fast twitch fibers for lifting heavy weights. He doesn't need to hold this weight up for a long time, and she doesn't need to lift up weights. And he doesn't need to run, so they've focused for different things. Once again, you can build more muscle cells pretty easy by exercise. Essentially what happens is you tear muscles, and then when the muscle gets torn, it repairs itself. And then as it repairs itself, it builds more muscle cells in place, and then those more muscle cells are able to do more work. And someone that is built up a lot of muscles in their body, they have to have a lot of work, a lot of exercise to maintain that muscle mass, or the muscles start to go back down to their natural state. They start to break down very quickly, and then that person can lose all that gained muscle mass. The body doesn't want to maintain that anymore simply because they don't need it and they're not using it, kind of thing. So that's pretty much all I've got for this one. A very quick little lecture. Make sure you check out the supplement videos and watch how those nerve cells actually innervate the bones in the muscles, and see how that signals descent and how muscle cells actually work. So if you have any questions or if you want to know anything else extra about this, just send me an email and let me know. Other than that, have a great rest of your day.